Along the east bank of the Euphrates, several square miles of suburbs formed a huge right triangle surrounding the inner city. A pair of mighty crenellated walls protected the area also. Additional walls lined the river banks and the fortified areas in the Old City, which contained the palaces and barracks. Moreover, 75 miles northwest of Babylon, the Great Median Wall, 50 miles long, stretched from the Euphrates to the Tigris River. So they got the rivers on either side of them, they live in between the rivers, and they'll put a wall up to the top, and that'll protect them. Just like the Great Wall of China and Hadrian's Wall across the top of Britain, and many another instance. Oh, there was a wall across the Peloponnesus to stop when the Persians invaded, and they built a wall just where Attica attaches to the Peloponnesus there. Old story. We'll just build a wall there. 50 miles long, this defensive wall. Towers rose at intervals from all these walls. Greek historians who wrote of Babylon's walls as a wonder of the world much exaggerated their height and length. Nevertheless, these fortifications made the city practically impregnable when held by a determined garrison. 8 fortified gates pierced the inner wall. The center gate on the northern side was the famous Ishtar Gate, the grandest structure of its kind ever built. Now, it used to be that there were 8 ways, 8 different places that you could get into the inner city. And if one of the gates is always crammed or busy or whatever, you go down to the next gate or whatever. Now we have like 6 or 8 main thoroughfares going in and out of the center of cities. Times change, but slowly. This colossal portal, now talking about the center gate on the northern side, was the Ishtar Gate. This colossal portal comprised a square tower of brick about 70 feet high and even larger in plan. Cutting through this tower was a lofty vaulted passage which could be closed off by 2 pairs of huge wooden doors. On the northward side of the gate proper, flanking the approach, stood 2 tall, slender towers. North of these, as a first line of defense, rose 2 smaller towers. The entire structure was finished with enameled bricks, blue on the towers and green and pink on the connecting walls. Enameled bricks, it's more difficult to make enameled than just regular mud brick, and the enameled are the only ones that would actually survive in rainstorms and so on. And so you would have private homes and cheap buildings would just be mud brick, and they'd have to be rebuilt once in a while. But temples and really expensive government structures would be enameled brick, and they would last a lot longer. And now we skip down a ways. Here inside the city were the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, another wonder of the world. The Hanging Gardens were a splendid roof garden, planted with trees and shrubs atop a pricely pleasure house. The roof that upheld the garden was waterproofed by layers of asphalt and sheet lead. The word hanging, which is what classical writers used, gives the misleading impression that the gardens were suspended on chains or cables. The word raised or elevated would give a more correct picture. Hanging was what they described, the bucket things that took water up to the gardens up on top of this building. And they hung in such a way, and they pumped the water up on top. And then the water would run down through, and can you imagine how nice and cool that house would be inside, out in the middle of this desert? So, hanging is a word that's become associated with the gardens, but suspended would be more accurate. They're just up on top of the building. Of Nebuchadnezzar's pleasure dome, only the basement survives. Hence, nobody really knows how the Hanging Gardens looked when they were new. Okay, skipping down a ways. In the basement, Koldewey, name of an archaeologist, Koldewey, found a peculiar structure. A well, which differs from all other wells known either in Babylon or elsewhere in the ancient world. It has 3 shafts placed close together, a square one in the center and oblong ones on each side, an arrangement for which I can see no other explanation than that a mechanical than that of a mechanical hydraulical machine, which stood here and worked on the same principle as our chain pump, where buckets attached to a chain worked on a wheel placed over a well. A whim or capstan works the wheel in an endless rotation. This contrivance, which is used today in this neighborhood, in the area where he's excavating, is called a dolab, D-O-L-A-B, a water bucket, and would provide a continuous flow of water. Interesting. If Koldewey is right, continuing with the text, the chain bearing the buckets extended up through the building to the roof gardens. Servants, heaving on the windlass bars, kept water flowing up night and day from the well to the king's precious plants. West of the hanging gardens, filling the space between this edifice and the river, stood a building with brick walls having the extraordinary thickness of 70 feet. This was evidently a fortress or a keep for a last-ditch stand. If our traveler continued south on the processional way, there were towering rainbow-hued ziggurat et kamanki towers rising as high as a modern 30-story building, and apartment houses up to 4 stories tall. That's quite an interest. Now these huge ziggurat are massive mud brick temples that are slightly sloped walls, and then it steps in, and there's another thing, and that steps in, and up at the top is the special. And there's nothing inside these. They're just piles of mud brick. It's like a version of the Great Pyramid. Solid, huge structure to get you up. I mean, they live on a big flat plain, so why not? They're fascinated with hills. Another wonder of Chaldean Babylon, the bridge over the Euphrates. Except for Nebuchadnezzar's Sennacherib's aqueduct at Jerwan, this is the oldest stone bridge of which there is any record. But whereas Sennacherib merely crossed a brook, Nabopolassar, who built this bridge, spanned one of the world's greatest rivers. Built at a time when the world's few bridges were flimsy affairs of tree trunks, reeds, or inflated goat skins, this bridge was almost as celebrated in the ancient world as the Hanging Gardens. For centuries it was the only structure of its kind in the world. Since the river has long since shifted its channel, the bases of the piers have been dug up in recent times. So now where the river used to flow is just sand. It's just an area out in the middle of a desert. The bridge was 380 feet long and rested on 7 streamlined piers of baked brick, stone, and timber, 28 by 65 feet in plan. The superstructure was of timber. According to Herodotus, it was a drawbridge. One or more of the wooden platforms which crossed from pier to pier were taken up at night to keep evildoers from using the bridge. And then boats, I assume. The Euphrates Bridge had a shortcoming shared by most large ancient bridges. The massive piers took up half the width of the river at that point, seriously impeding the flow of water. At flood time there was a danger that the swift current, speeded up still more by this constriction, might scour away the river bottom round the piers until they collapsed, or that debris might gather on the upstream side. Nevertheless, this bridge may be counted the most signal engineering advance of the Chaldean Empire. In Babylon. Under the Persians, Babylonian savants accomplished some of their greatest achievements in astronomy and mathematics. In 482 BC, Babylon revolted against King Xerxes. Now, interesting, because Xerxes was involved in an attack on ancient Greece. And 482 is right during the golden age of the Greek people in Athens. The Persians sent his best general, who swiftly retook the city and harshly punished it. Nebuchadnezzar's great walls were partly torn down to make them useless for defense, and Xerxes carried off the 18-foot statue of Marduk and melted down the gold for his treasury. So Babylon revolted against the king, and I believe he was in Greece when the revolt took place, and he had to head